This is Killer Innovations, a show about ideas, creativity, and how you can innovate. Welcome to the Innovator's Garage, where you learn to create your next game-changing killer innovation.
Welcome to this week's Killer Innovations. I am back in Colorado from being on the road, so I'm enjoying the early spring weather here, trying to catch up. I came back and there was a whole stack of books from some new exciting authors that have been putting out some great stuff. I mean, I've got a reading stack that's going to last me well through the summer. I don't have to worry about procuring any books for my beach reading time. But one book in particular that caught my eye that was top of the stack is the new book from Mark Stevenson, We Do Things Differently. The Outsiders Rebooting Our World. Now, if you're not familiar with Mark, Mark is an author. He's got multiple books out. But I think this one actually, the title I think is actually pretty descriptive of the content. And I've asked Mark to join us today, talk a little bit more about himself, and then we're going to dig into this book in today's show. So Mark is joining us from London. So Mark, thank you for taking the time and joining us here on Killer Innovations.
Well, thank you for having me.
So Mark, for those of our listeners who don't know you or haven't seen your previous book, I know you from your book on the Optimist Tour of the Future, but give us a little context. What's your background? How did you get so involved in kind of this, entrepreneurship, innovation, future kind of content? So how do you weave all that together?
That's a really great question. There's no, I don't have a normal career progression. In fact, I would say that I'm probably an unemployable dilettante. So the short story is I'm a geek by training. I'm a kind of a crypto computing guy. I had a normal job or kind of a brain for hire kind of job as a crypto geek and a computing guy for the first 10 years of my career, but also simultaneously a musician. And my band had an album out and a couple of singles here in Europe. And then that all fell apart. The drummer went to jail, etc.
Okay, that's a whole nother show.
I decided to get myself a proper corporate job. Realized that I hated that. But it taught me a lot. And then I just thought, what do I really care about? And I realized I cared about two things, which is kind of battling cynicism, because I think cynicism is the ultimate enemy of the future. And just kind of making people literate about stuff I think, is crucial, regardless of your background, whether it's climate change or sequencing the human genome or what's happening with AI. I think these things affect everybody. And I kind of wanted to communicate those in a way that was kind of anti-cynical. So how can we use these tools to make the world better rather than always fearing them, but also being very aware of, that they come with lots of, difficult questions. And the way I decided to do that first and foremost was by stand-up comedy. So I quit my job and became a stand-up comedian. So doing gigs up and down the UK and in Europe, about everything from quantum physics to climate change to AI or genetics or pharmacology or whatever. Because my idea was like, this stuff is important to everybody, and yet most of this stuff is written by geeks for geeks, and I want to communicate to everybody because I think it's important stuff. Did that for a year. As a result of that, got offered a book deal, which was my first book. That book did very well. It's 12 languages, I think, now. And then people just started, and the great thing about the book was it did what I wanted. It started getting read, not by geeks, although lots of geeks read it, but it started getting read by CEOs, investors, stay-at-home parents, teachers, a really wide cross-section of people said, wow, this stuff is interesting and kind of entertaining. And so that kind of just turned into people phoning up and going, hey, I read your book, changed the way I think about the future. Will you come and work with us? And so eventually I became, I guess, a futurist. That led to the second book, which I've written now. And so there's no qualifications for being a futurist, right? You just have to write something with the word future in the title, as far as I can work out. And that's how you become one. So
yeah, well, that's actually quite funny. In fact, I was just at the TED event up in Vancouver, and somebody grabbed me by the shoulder and said, hey, have you met the new futurist for HP? I spent 10 years of my career as the CTO, and I'm like, okay, I wonder what his LinkedIn profile looks like. To be using the title of a futurist.
Yeah, and there's really no qualification. And actually, I don't really like being called a futurist because actually futurism is very often associated with prediction, and human beings are very bad at prediction for a couple of reasons. First, they always, predict from within their own set of prejudices. They like to, kind of predict from their own frame of reference, whether it's Harry Warner saying, who's one of the Warner brothers in 1927 saying, who the hell wants to hear actors talk, through to the head of the Digital Equipment Corporation in 1977 saying there's no reason anybody on a computer in their home. I mean, these people, their business models predicate one thing and they predict into that kind of view. And the other reason is the second, third order, fourth order effects of any new innovation hitting society are too hard to predict. So internet arrives. It doesn't take a genius to predict email, but nobody really predicts social media. Nobody predicts the role of social media in spreading fake news and how that might affect our democratic process. So, that's why I don't really think of myself as a predictive guy, but what I do is I help my clients, I guess, become literate about the questions the future is asking them. And then I say to them, I don't know what the future is going to be because it depends how you answer those questions, but I'm going to try and encourage you to answer those questions in the service of making the world more sustainable, equitable, humane, or just.
So, Mark, I want to back up a little bit because your first book, the title is The Optimist Tour of the Future. And you were commenting on the fact that, cynicism can, be kind of a real downer from the standpoint of, looking at how innovation could happen. And we've been hearing, particularly in Silicon Valley with Elon Musk and everybody screaming about, the risks of AI going amok. And it was a topic at TED this year, or, robots taking everybody's, job away. So how do you be an optimist in this case when you are, when everybody's such a downer out there on some of these things?
So there's two things to say about that, in that what the media reports is all the bad stuff. So if Elon Musk says, 100 great things about artificial intelligence, how it's going to be a boon for productivity in society, and he says one thing, that it says, oh, well, I'm a bit worried about this bit, guess what the media reports on?
Right.
So you get a very skewed view of that for a start. The point about jobs is very well made, but, technology has always destroyed jobs. In fact, I collect headlines from the last 200 years of, technology destroying jobs. Kind of scaremongering. And there's a great one, actually, from one of my favorites, from 1973 from the Times in London. And the headline is, Prime Minister must act to stop microchips that kill jobs. So, you're kind of thinking, did microchips kill jobs? Of course they didn't. Okay, but what they did do is they changed jobs. So there is a very valid point here, which is the transition of one economy to another. A transition from an economy without these machines to an economy with the machines means that certain jobs do disappear. And my worry is it's the people who aren't being taught, or an education system that doesn't help you to retrain to that new economy. So with artificial intelligence, we need to create an economy of the jobs the machines can't do. And those are jobs of empathy, systems thinking, asking the right question, all that kind of stuff. And this is not stuff that our current economy, and particularly our current education systems, really value, and that's very problematic to me. So a lot of people get very damaged in those transitions, and one of the reasons I do the job I do is I want to try and make that transition less messy for less people and make it a little bit shorter. So the fears are real, but the solutions are out there, and my job, I think, as a futurist, is to say, if we're more literate about these things, and actually if we have a more diverse group of people more literate about these things, we might be able to have more of the benefits and less of the downsides, and that's kind of why I do what I do.
Yeah, but I mean, I'm with you because it's a battle for those of us in this in this role that we play as far as trying to educate in my case the listener of my show and your readers of your book. But one of the frustrations that I have though is policymakers. You think about governments and you watched if you watched the Mark Zuckerberg questions that were happening, and you hear some of those questions and you're like, oh my God, these are our elected officials, and they've you realize they probably have never logged on to Facebook, and they've never ever seen sent a tweet. And here are the people who are trying to be engaged and to set a policy without understanding consequences of some of those decisions.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very well-made point. And what we're going to, and I talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly in my work a lot. And the bad news is everything is broken, including our systems of governance, because they cannot keep pace with the pace of change. And the good news is it's fixable, but the ugly news is it's going to get messy. And our current systems of governance and the way we run our corporations and we run our health service and the way we educate ourselves are necessarily going to have to change over the next 20 years. And that's going to be a bit of a bloodbath. And some nations will get it right. Estonia is starting to do some very interesting things in e-governance. Those nations will have a massive competitive advantage, and everybody else will have to follow. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Policymakers are way behind.
Yeah, and this gets into the issue of, if you're expecting the government to set policies to drive futures, they don't act fast enough given the innovation rate that these changes are happening.
It's like waiting for Donald Trump to write a feminist novel. It's never going to happen. And if it did, it'd be terrible.
Hey, with that, we're going to take a quick commercial break. We'll come right back, continue our conversation with Mark Stevenson, the author of We Do Things Differently. And in the meantime, if you are a listener to the show and you want to check out the links that we're going to talk about today, hop on over to killerinnovations.com. And we're going to be right back after this quick commercial break. Welcome back to Killer Innovations. We're having a conversation today with Mark Stevenson, the author of We Do Things Differently, The Outsiders Rebooting Our World. Now, Mark, as an author myself, there's always was, when I wrote my book, when it came out back in 2012, there was something in the back of my mind that was kind of triggering an interest. I'm always interested with authors of what was it? Was there one thing you came across or something that you just felt like you had to do this book? What was the catalyst for your new book?
Well, it actually ties in very nicely with the question you asked at the end of the last segment. So after I'd written my first book, The Optimist Tour of the Future, I came to the conclusion at the end of that we had all the technology and the talent we need to solve all the world's problems. It wasn't like we need to invent one new thing to have a world that was sustainable, equitable, humane, or just. The problem was that we couldn't seem to organize our talents and our technologies and our cultures in a way that made that feasible for the maximum amount of people and indeed the environment. So I thought I really want to go and look at systems change. I want to go and look at how we organize ourselves. I'm going to go and find people who've challenged existing systems, old systems of doing things, and come up with new ways of doing that. And the question is not me saying, this is what I think we should do. It's me saying, look, Jamie's gone and done this in healthcare. How did he do it? How did he prevail? What can we learn from him? And does this give us a roadmap to and a window on a better future? And to get into the book, you had to be succeeding in a systems change way, and you had to have been succeeding for a number of years, or the technology had to be so unequivocally working that I could touch it and see it. And that was kind of the inspiration for the book. So less about technology, there's a lot of technology in it, more about what are the ways of thinking, ways of organizing that allow the human race to prosper in the future.
But, it's an interesting concept, right? Of how, what it's kind of the ripple effect, things that people do today and their impact on the future, right?
Yeah.
And in some cases, though, what I've seen, and I'd be interested in getting your view is you have to be careful of unintended consequences. You think you're doing something, and then all of a sudden things are just massively spiral out of control.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's hard. But that's hard. It's hard to think in those contexts, even in a systems view. And in many cases, I've seen a lot of innovators don't think about the unintended consequences of their invention. And you always have to ask the question: is every innovation or every action good just because you can do it?
No, absolutely not. And another reason I don't like really becoming a futurist is because futurists are very often of the mindset that a new innovation or new technology is going to solve everything. Technology is the answer. And I'm always of the opinion that technology isn't the answer, it's a question. And it says, given this new technology, this new way of thinking, what are we going to do with it? How are we going to use it sensibly? And that does require systems thinking. So a really good example is, one of the motivations behind driverless cars is the idea that it will reduce car accidents because driverless cars are actually much safer. And every time there's a crash, that information gets fed back into the whole fleet. And, driving becomes as safe as, the absence of driving becomes as safe as flying is. And that's true. And I think that that's many good reasons why we should have driverless cars. But an unintended consequence of that, of course, is that we run out of organs for transplants. Another unintended consequence is that more abusive partners can get home drunk more easily, and domestic violence goes up. And the studies that already show this kind of stuff happening. So it's always about having that systems view. And in my work, I guess where I think my strength is that I will go into a technology company and I will talk about demographics, democracy, social justice, but I'll also go into a technology company and talk about those things. And I'll bring the technology into the policy making. Because look, if you're thinking about this stuff in isolation, you're going to make bad decisions. there will be unintended consequences, but let's try and make those less than we think if you're thinking systemically. And the problem with a lot of innovators, I find, and I say this as a huge, fan of people with innovative mindset, is they tend to innovate within their own kind of little silo. I'm going to solve this one problem without necessarily thinking that by solving that problem, they're creating a whole bunch of others. And that's what I bring to the party, I think, which is, I'm as I said, an unemployable dilettante, a terrible generalist. But one of my clients says the great thing about you, Mark, is you're the grand question asker. So every time they're coming up with a solution, I'm going, that's great. I really like it. Here's 3 questions we need to ask to make sure we deploy that sensibly with the least impact harmfully and the most impact beneficially.
Yeah, and I think you've nailed it right on the head, right? A lot of innovators just never ask the question.
No.
They just think if they see where they're at today and they see the path forward as a single straight line. And it's never a straight line.
And also sometimes they ask the entirely wrong question because they think they're innovating and they're not. So I'll give you an example of my favorite, least useful innovation of recent years. It's something called the Kerastase Hair Coach. It's a Wi-Fi enabled hairbrush with a microphone that analyzes your brushing style. It analyzes humidity and gives you a hair manageability score via a smartphone app. It's like, which question is that answering? And millions of dollars went into that. But you say, you laugh at that and you think, well, that's ridiculous. Then you go, well, iPhone X. Like, what question is that asking? Who needed that? What is it for? And the only innovation of any note I can find in the iPhone X is you can now have an animated emoji to express your inner panda. The only question it asks is how much more money can Apple take and put offshore? So there are large organizations that are asking dumb questions. And your analyst, Apple is supposed to be an innovative company. Well, I don't see any innovation in the iPhone X. I'm more interested in things like open source drug discovery coming out of Delhi, where they're coming up with new drugs for tuberculosis for $15 million, as opposed to the $2.6 billion that the American pharmaceutical industry says it costs to make a new drug. That's innovation for me because it saves thousands of lives rather than saving, Apple a bunch of tax dollars.
Where do I go with that? Given I used to work for a Fortune 5 company. But it is, the challenge is, you talked about, the Bluetooth connected hairbrush, and there's been a lot of people, ranting on these Bluetooth toothbrushes, right?
Yeah.
But you're right. The question is, it's really the question, or it's the technology someone's developed and they don't have the solution. I tell the story, of a product at HP that a bunch of engineers developed. And when I looked at it, I figured out that the total market was 47,000 people. Why? Because only an HP engineer, and there's 47,000 of them, would ever figure out how to use this darn thing. Everybody saw themselves as the representative example of a customer. And if you're in the technology world or in the innovation game, and you're trying to solve your own problem that you think, be careful. You're not the best representative example of a customer for it.
And also the way that we are asked to, innovate, the way we work is we're motivated by a certain set of measures, and in some cases those are the wrong measures. It's like, how much more money can you make? Actually, well, you may be doing huge damage to the environment, which at some point society is going to have to clean up, and that's going to cost the economy more than your innovation contributed to it. There's a great quote by Eli Goldratt, a physicist who became a business guru in the 80s. He said, "Tell me how you're going to measure me, but if you measure me strangely, don't be surprised if I act perversely." And many innovators act perversely because they're using the wrong measures of success.
Yeah, perfect. We've on this show we've talked a lot about bad metrics. Be careful of what you measure because people will work to the measurement. We're going to take another quick commercial break. When we come back, we're going to dig into more of the content of Mark Stevens' new book, We Do Things Differently. So don't go anywhere. We're going to be right back after this commercial break. And also don't forget, all the links and notes will be over at Killer Innovations. So check out the show notes. And we'll be back right after this break. Welcome back to Innovations. We're having a conversation today with Mark Stevenson, the author of We Do Things Differently. Hey, Mark, in a book like this, where you're taking a look at a lot of different perspectives, can you boil down kind of what the findings were? What was kind of the takeaways as you were doing the research for this book?
Well, as with all those questions, there's no kind of thing that covers all of them, but I can give you a general view, which is, how do you create systems change that actually works? Mm-hmm. And this doesn't apply to all of the innovations I covered, but you can say that probably in 80% of them, it's usually bottom up. It's not top down. It usually comes from a crowd of people who, by out of necessity, have kind of worked out they've got to do something differently. Often it comes from places that are very broken, where something's gone horribly wrong. That change is usually catalyzed by a new technology that has now been democratized and now have access to some tools they didn't have last time, or a new way of thinking that's arrived. Actually, now with this way of thinking, we can do this differently. We can do this as a network. It's very often in the service of a new social contract. So people are kind of rejecting the idea of I'm just a consumer. I want to be a citizen now. I don't want to just be given choices. I want to make those choices. I want to decide what those choices are. And it's usually, not always, but it's usually catalyzed by some kind of outsider. It's from somebody from outside the existing system. So if you look, for instance, at Patients Like Me, which is a patient network born out of Boston, that was created by Jamie Hayward, who's a mechanical engineer, because his brother was dying from ALS. Now, he's a mechanical engineer. He had no medical training, and it turned out that the network he created has more power than any drug ever created. So it's that kind of, that would be the jump. And the other thing I would say about all the innovators, which I'm sure is a theme that comes up on your show all the time, is that they had in almost Herculean levels of perseverance. The outside of the catalyst person, they had Herculean levels of, I will just keep on going no matter what you throw at me. And usually it was because they had this very powerful extrinsic motivation, the death of a family member, or in Samir Brahmachari's case, I mentioned open source drug discovery before the break. He was like, I have 4,000 of my country men and women dying every day for tuberculosis, and I've got to do something about this. So they're very powerfully driven. They just don't give up. They use bottom-up systems, catalyzed with new technologies in the service of a different social contract rather than one of just making money, and they just keep going.
So let's talk about each one of these a little bit. Crises. You talked a little bit about the fact that there was some kind of a thing that was happening, whether it be a family member, that turns into a motivator. Yeah. What I've seen and what I'm interested in getting your view on is organizations or societies that everything's going great, everything's hunky-dory, getting any, it's kind of the anti-change problem. Why change? Everything's good. Don't rock the boat. Those kinds of things. I'm interested in the fact of on the crises piece, from the standpoint of is that really kind of a cornerstone need, or can changes in the future actually just be triggered just by change itself, or is there always some form of this crises that's kind of the kicking off point?
Well, right now, if we look at humanity, we are suffering an enormous crisis. So we need to innovate our ass out of this. We have less than 60 harvests left at the current rate of soil erosion. Soil erosion is costing the US economy $44 billion a year. Okay, because we're pumping the soil with too many fertilizers and pesticides, all that kind of stuff, and it's destroying the integrity of the soil. It's not replacing itself as fast as it's being eroded. We have a corporate world where 85% of the employees don't like their jobs. We have a wealth and economic system where 1% of the population own 50% of the wealth. The healthcare system is not a healthcare system. It's a massively labyrinthine and expensive sick care system. The governance system still looks like it did in the 1850s, and the education system still thinks it is 1950. We have to innovate, whether we like it or not. Now, those systems are either going to collapse horribly, and there'll be nothing to replace them, or we innovate our ass off and they still collapse horribly, but we've got something better, in the bag. So I'm not really interested in innovation, that's sort of tickling along there. It's like we look at the grand systemic crises that are facing the world, and if you're not inspired to innovate in that situation, then what are you for?
Well, it's interesting because I guess maybe now that I'm listening to you, and I probably could frame the question a little bit better, right? It's the ubiquitous knowledge of the crises, right? Yeah. Because we end up spending a lot of conversation time around, someone positioning a crisis and somebody else saying, well, that's really not a crisis. Mm-hmm. Everything will be fine, or that crisis is being blown out of proportion. Steve Pinker gave a talk at TED last week about his new book. And I got a chance to spend a little bit of time with him, and his whole thing was, we claim these crises to try to get change going, but when you really look at some of the data, people are now throwing things around about there's no crises. You can't get to how do you agree that the crisis there is a crisis around something, and you get people, moving. Otherwise, you kind of get, half the people saying yes and half the people saying no, and then it has ramifications through policy and governments and societal's willingness to invest.
That's a really important question. So, there's no point in making a crisis that doesn't exist, because at the end of the day, you just end up looking like a fool, and you wasted your career dealing with something that wasn't there. One of my sort of ways I research stuff is, and as you'll see from the book, I go and see. It's like, I don't sit in my room. And I'm a big fan of Steven Pinker. I have a lot of respect for him. But, if I want to go and find out if there's a crisis in soil erosion, I will go to the places where they say it is, and I will talk to the scientists, and I will look at the soil, and then I'll go and talk to the people who are trying to fix it. One of my sort of ways I research stuff is, and as you'll see from the book, I go and see. It's like, I don't sit in my room. And I'm a big fan of Steven Pinker. I have a lot of respect for him. But, if I want to go and find out if there's a crisis in soil erosion, I will go to the places where they say it is, and I will talk to the scientists, and I will look at the soil, and then I'll go and talk to the people who are trying to fix it. So that is my view. And then how do you convince people? Well, I don't know, but I'm trying to do my bit in that I'm writing these books. I'm on your show. I'm just negotiating, I think, a very large TV series with a large American network to talk about the problems and the solutions mapping. So I'm trying to do that cultural thing that you are, which is saying there are real problems. We can innovate. And by the way, innovating is where all the fun is. I like to say that the people on the right side of innovation are trying to make the world better. These are the people I want to hang out with. They have more sex with more interesting people, go to more interesting parties, drink better cocktails. But, if that doesn't want to get you on the right side of innovation, I don't know what will.
And you're exactly right, though. I mean, it is about don't do the false crises, but when there is a crisis, we do need to rally, and we've rallied, right? We solved the polio vaccine. We've solved, the invention of antibiotics to minimize deaths. We're never going to run out of these challenges. And that's human ingenuity has allowed us to solve the problems now. The key is where do we focus? And I think that's what your book does a really good job of positioning on is, what are some of those problems that we should be thinking about those innovations on? And what are other people doing and motivating people to think, to innovate and solve some other problems or issues?
Yeah. And the other thing I would say is that solving these problems is not an overnight thing. There's a kind of a cult of innovation that says, we'll flick a switch and technology will save it in the next 6 months. And actually, we're thinking about what's wrong with the education system or the food system or the energy system. This is a generational shift. It's going to take 30 years. And, as I say, the good, the bad, and the ugly, the bad is it's broken. The good is it's fixable. The ugly is it's going to be a messy 20 years.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, in fact, in my book, I got asked to innovate K through 12 education in the United States.
Yeah.
Yeah. If anybody ever offers me that project again, I'm going to run for the hills. So, so Mark, as we wrap up here, one, I want to thank you for spending the time with us. If people want to find out more about you and your books, what's the best coordinates for them to track you down at?
I guess just my Twitter handle, which is @OptimistOnTour, or my website, which is just markstevenson.org, and that's Stevenson with a V.
Yeah, STEVENSON, and we will be we'll have all those links up on the show notes over at killerinnovations.com. And so the book's out. How long has the book been out? It's actually pretty.
It's been out since January in the States, I think.
Okay, yeah, I was gonna say. It came in while I was on the road in my mobile studio. So, hey, Mark, everybody, check this out. Go find it. I'll have the links up on the site. You can go get it over at Amazon or any of the booksellers and check it out. I think it's a real eye-opener and definitely gives you a different perspective. And again, Mark, thank you very much for taking the time out of your schedule and connecting with us from London. And with that, we're going to wrap up this part of the show. And don't forget, we will have all the links, coordinates, show notes over at killerinnovations.com. And if you have a guest who you think would be great on the show, drop me a note at phil@killerinnovations.com. Don't go anywhere. In the next segment, we will share another one of the 5 minutes to new ideas exercises and questions. So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after this quick commercial break. Back in the early days of this show, I would share what I called a killer question in each episode. These questions were designed to be used in your personal, team, or organization's innovation efforts. Now, based on feedback from listeners just like you, we've decided to bring it back with some improvements. Each episode of the Killer Innovations has a segment that I'm now calling 5 Minutes to New Ideas. It's designed for the creative mind looking for that next great idea. Each episode will challenge you to think differently about yourself, your business, and your products and services by asking unique, funny, and sometimes crazy questions. These questions are designed to force you to look beyond the obvious and to uncover ideas and opportunities you never before considered. So, get out your notebook and be ready to uncover that game-changing idea. Here is 5 Minutes to New Ideas. No matter what business we are in, we're all fighting essentially the same fight. Designing a product that a customer will prefer or even crave over the competition. To do this, we need to constantly be aware of how, 1, our business environments are evolving, and 2, how our customers are changing, and 3, what we need to modify in order to keep our product relevant and desirable. My guess is that you are watching and tracking what your competitors are doing. And that's good, or even great, but not sufficient. You can't just look at your competitors to get a sense of how you are faring in the global business space. To win, you need to take the time and look at other businesses, other industries that have similar key elements in common with you. I've spent my entire career in the tech industry, and for my other industry, I found the airline industry endlessly fascinating. It, like the tech industry, has gradually found ways to make its core products less expensive and more accessible to the general public. However, in return, their customers have had to accept a vast reduction in services and expectations. It's an interesting seesaw between what the customer truly wants and what they are willing to give up in order to get it. In the center are the core essentials. A safe, convenient flight at a low fare. Everything else falls away in relevance, as long as that core criteria is met. What is the core criteria for your business? What are the fundamentals that have been in place in order to maintain an ongoing and happy relationship between you and your customer? Suppose you were the head of operations at a megachurch, perhaps Chicago's Willow Creek or Joel Osteen's church in Houston. Osteen's church seats almost 16,000 people and runs 4 worship services plus various meeting groups every Sunday, which means there are up to 64,000 people in the cars they're driving coming in and out of the church parking lot. This means that the odds of getting into a fender bender are increasing, not to mention the gridlock and potentially dangerous traffic in the church's parking lot. So what do you do? Where do you go to learn the mechanics of moving that number of vehicles and that number of human beings in an efficient and safe manner? Now, you could go observe how traffic and parking is done at your local mall, or maybe the Sunday football game. If you're truly serious about solving this problem, you go to Disney Academy at Walt Disney World. Now, entertaining legions of small children with animatronic animals and teacup rides doesn't have much in common with preaching about God, but 60 years of crowd management has made Disney operations the undisputed champion of event control and coordination. By working with Disney, these churches could learn a few things about integrating their system of traffic flow and parking. Fender benders would go down, customer satisfaction would go up, and everybody would be happier. To learn and be inspired by others, ask yourself, what industries are analogous to ours, and what can we learn from them? Warning, this is much harder than it sounds. You need to dig deep, asking yourself, what industries or businesses that are unrelated to yours are dealing with issues similar to yours? For example, the issues of production, customer segments, marketing. Next, what are the lessons learned in terms of the push and pull between where those businesses are succeeding and where they are failing? And also ask yourself, what are some of the non-business examples with similar issues to you? Is there an NGO? Is there a nonprofit that has kind of similar challenges that you do? Take a look at them. By asking the right questions and looking at non-obvious companies and industries, you may find that one inspiration that can transform you and your ideas. I'm Phil McKinney, and thanks for listening. Thanks for taking the time out of your busy schedule to join in. If you have any comments or suggestions, drop me a note at phil@killerinnovations.com. Beyond this show, I write about my personal experiences of being in the innovation game for the last 2 decades. Topics include innovation, creativity, culture, team building, metrics, frustrations, leadership, and how to win. You can find that content over at philmckinney.com. You can also find out information about my book, Beyond the Obvious, including extensive excerpts over at beyondtheobvious.com. You can find hardcover, digital, and audio versions of my book on Amazon or wherever you get your books from. Now, the reason I started this show back in 2005 was to pay back my early mentor. My first mentor, Bob Davis, invested an immense amount of time in training and coaching me, which had a major impact on my career. When I went back and asked him how I could pay him back, he laughed and said I couldn't. I had to pay it forward. If I could ask for a favor, could you help me pay it forward? How? 1, by giving us a rating wherever you get your podcast, as that helps spread the word. And 2, by telling others about the show. If you want to be part of the conversation between the shows, I hang out in the Innovators community on Slack. The Innovators community is a private community of vetted innovators who help each other succeed. Check it out at theinnovators.community. This episode of Killer Innovations was produced by the Innovators Network. You can find the show notes and the entire show catalog going back to 2005 at killerinnovations.com. I'll talk to you next week, and in the meantime, go out and change the world with your killer innovation. Bye-bye.